The night was unusually quiet in Paris when received the emergency call that would change his life forever. As a senior firefighter with over 15 years of experience, had seen countless accidents, saved hundreds of lives, and faced situations that would break most people. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him in the tunnel on August 31, 1997. Was enjoying a rare, peaceful evening at the fire station when the alarm bells shattered the silence. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio with urgency that made every firefighter in the station stop what they were doing. A serious car accident had occurred in one of Paris's most famous tunnels. Multiple vehicles were involved, and there were reports of severe injuries. Within minutes, and his team were racing through the streets of Paris, their sirens cutting through the late-night traffic. The city that never truly sleeps seemed unusually subdued that evening, as if it somehow knew that history was about to be made in the worst possible way. Checked his equipment one final time as their fire truck approached the tunnel entrance. He had no idea that the next few hours would thrust him into one of the most scrutinized and controversial events of the 20th century. As they entered the tunnel, the scene that greeted them was one of absolute chaos. The smell of burning metal and gasoline filled the air, mixing with the acrid smoke that billowed from the wreckage. Emergency lights from police cars and ambulances created an eerie disco effect against the tunnel walls, casting dancing shadows that made the scene even more surreal. Trained eyes immediately assessed the situation. A black Mercedes had crashed into the 13th pillar of the tunnel with devastating force. The vehicle was so badly damaged that it was barely recognizable as a car. The front end was completely crushed, and the roof had been partially torn away. Glass and metal debris were scattered across the tunnel floor like deadly confetti. But it wasn't just the physical destruction that struck. There was something different about this accident scene. Usually, curious onlookers would gather at a safe distance, but tonight, photographers with large cameras were pushing against the police barriers, their flashes creating an almost strobe light effect. The intensity of their efforts to get closer to the wreckage was unlike anything had ever witnessed. As approached the vehicle, he could see that there were 4 people inside. 3 were clearly in critical condition, but one passenger in the back seat appeared to be conscious and moving slightly. This gave him hope. In his years of emergency response, had learned that where there was consciousness, there was often a fighting chance for survival. The passenger who caught his attention was a woman in elegant clothing. Despite the chaos around her, she maintained a certain dignity that was striking. Her eyes were open, and she was trying to communicate, though her voice was weak. Immediately began his assessment while calling for additional medical equipment. What didn't know at that moment was that he was looking at Diana, Princess of Wales, one of the most beloved and photographed women in the world. To him, she was simply another accident victim who needed his help, another human being whose life hung in the balance. This professional detachment would prove to be both a blessing and a burden in the years that followed. As work to stabilize the situation and prepare for extraction, he noticed something that would haunt him for years to come. Despite her injuries and the traumatic situation, the woman seemed more concerned about others than herself. She kept trying to look around, as if checking on her companions, even though moving caused her obvious pain. The extraction process was delicate and dangerous. The car was so badly damaged that removing the passengers required extreme care to avoid causing additional injuries. Coordinated with his team and the medical personnel who had arrived on scene, ensuring that every move was calculated and precise. During those crucial minutes, as work to free the passengers from the twisted metal that had become their prison, he found himself speaking softly to the conscious woman, trying to keep her calm and aware. He had learned over the years that talking to accident victims, maintaining human connection, could sometimes make the difference between life and death. The woman responded to his voice, though her words were difficult to understand due to her injuries and the shock of the accident. Could tell she was fighting to stay conscious, fighting to communicate something important. Her determination impressed him, even as it broke his heart to see someone struggling so hard against such overwhelming circumstances. As they finally managed to extract her from the vehicle, accompanied the medical team as they prepared her for transport to the hospital. During those final moments at the accident scene, as the woman was being placed on a stretcher, she managed to speak more clearly. Her words were few, but they would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. The ride to the hospital felt eternal, though it lasted only minutes. Rode along, continuing to monitor the woman's condition and provide what comfort he could. She drifted in and out of consciousness, but during her lucid moments, she continued to show remarkable strength and grace. It was only when they arrived at the hospital and heard the hushed, urgent conversations among the medical staff that he began to understand the true magnitude of what had happened. Names were whispered with reverence and shock. The reality of who he had been trying to save slowly began to dawn on him. Princess Diana, the people's princess, the woman who had captured the world's heart with her compassion and humanitarian work, had been in his care during those crucial first moments after the accident. The woman whose hand he had held, whose final words he had heard, was mourned by millions around the globe. But she would always remain the brave woman who fought for life in those dark moments in the tunnel, the person who showed grace under the most horrific circumstances, and the voice that spoke words he would carry with him forever. The weeks following that terrible night in August brought changes to his life that he could never have imagined. The quiet firefighter who had dedicated his career to saving lives suddenly found himself at the center of a global media storm. Reporters from every major news outlet in the world wanted to speak with him, to hear his account of those final moments with Princess Diana. Struggled with the attention. He had always believed that his job was to serve and protect, not to seek fame or recognition. The idea of profiting from someone's tragedy, especially someone as beloved as Princess Diana, felt wrong to him. For months, he declined every interview request, turned away every journalist who appeared at his fire station, and refused every offer to tell his story. But the weight of what he had witnessed, what he had heard, began to take its toll. Found himself lying awake at night, replaying those moments in the tunnel over and over again. He thought about Diana's words, about her courage in those final moments, and about whether the world deserved to know the truth about how she had faced her death. His fellow firefighters noticed the change in. The jovial man who had always been quick with a joke or a reassuring word became quieter, more thoughtful. He threw himself into his work with even greater intensity, as if trying to save every life could somehow make up for the one he couldn't save that night in the tunnel. His wife watched her husband struggle with his burden of knowledge. She saw how he would sometimes stop mid-conversation, his eyes distant, clearly lost in memories of that night. She encouraged him to talk to someone, perhaps a counselor or therapist, but insisted he was fine. He had dealt with traumatic situations before, he reasoned. This was just another part of the job. But this wasn't just another rescue attempt. This was Princess Diana, and the world's grief was palpable. Everywhere went, he saw her photograph. Newspapers, television programs, magazines, and billboards all featured her image. Memorial services were held around the world. Flowers piled up outside palace in unprecedented displays of public mourning. The most difficult part was watching the speculation and conspiracy theories that began to emerge. Wild stories circulated about what had really happened in the tunnel, about Diana's final moments, about whether she could have been saved. Some reports suggested she had died instantly. Others claimed she had lived for hours. None of them seemed to match what had actually witnessed. 6 months after the accident, made his first public statement. It was brief and factual, simply confirming that he had been part of the rescue team and that Princess Diana had been conscious when he first reached her. He refused to elaborate, stating that he preferred to respect the privacy of the royal family during their time of grief. This statement only intensified the media attention. Now that it confirmed he had direct contact with Diana, the pressure for more details became overwhelming. Reporters camped outside his home. His fire station received dozens of calls daily from news organizations around the world. Some offered substantial sums of money for an exclusive interview. The constant scrutiny began affecting his family life. His children, who had been proud of their father's heroic profession, now found themselves the subjects of unwanted attention at school. Classmates asked them endless questions about what their father had seen, what Diana had said, whether she had suffered. Found it difficult to leave the house without being approached by journalists or curious members of the public. During this time, also had to deal with the official investigations into the accident. French authorities conducted a thorough inquiry and was interviewed multiple times about his observations and actions that night. Each retelling of the events forced him to relive those traumatic moments, but he understood the importance of providing accurate information for the investigation. The investigators were particularly interested in Diana's condition when first reached her. Had she been conscious? Had she spoken? What exactly had she said? answered their questions honestly and completely, but he found himself becoming increasingly protective of the more personal details of his interaction with Diana. One particular detail that shared with investigators but kept from the public was Diana's apparent concern for others even in her critical condition. Despite her own injuries, she had asked about the other passengers in the car. This selflessness in her final conscious moments reinforced belief that she had been a truly special person. As the first anniversary of Diana's death approached, the media attention intensified once again, received renewed requests for interviews, with even larger financial offers. Some journalists attempted to ambush him at work or at home, hoping to catch him off guard and get him to reveal something new about that night. It was during this period that began to seriously consider speaking publicly about his experience. Not for money or fame, but because he felt that Diana deserved to have her story told accurately by someone who had been there. Too many false narratives were circulating, too much speculation was being presented as fact. Consulted with his family, his colleagues, and even a priest about the moral implications of sharing what he knew. Was it his place to reveal Diana's final words? Would speaking publicly honor her memory or exploit it? These questions kept him awake at night, weighing on his conscience. His captain at the fire station, a man respected greatly, offered some perspective. "You are the only person who can tell the truth about those final moments," he said. "If you don't speak, others will continue to speak for you, and their versions may not be accurate. Sometimes the truth is more important than privacy." This conversation planted a seed in his mind. Perhaps he did have a responsibility to share what he knew, not for personal gain, but to ensure that Diana's final moments were remembered accurately and with dignity. The world had loved her in life. Perhaps they deserved to know how brave she had been in death. But still hesitated. The words Diana had spoken to him felt sacred, like a trust that had been placed in his hands. Speaking publicly would mean sharing that trust with the world, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that responsibility. As the media circus continued to swirl around him, made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would tell Diana's story, but he would do it on his own terms, in his own time, and in a way that honored both her memory and the truth of what had really happened in that tunnel on the night that changed everything. 20 years had passed since that fateful night in the tunnel. Had aged, as all men do, but the weight of what he had witnessed seemed to have aged him more than his years. His hair had turned completely gray, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights and the burden of carrying one of the world's most significant secrets. During those 2 decades, had maintained his silence about the specific details of Diana's final moments. He had given brief statements to investigators and had occasionally corrected false information when it became too widespread, but he had never fully told his story. The world had moved on in many ways, but the fascination with Princess Diana had never truly faded. New books were published every year about her life and death. Documentary filmmakers continued to examine every aspect of the accident. Conspiracy theories persisted, despite official investigations that had thoroughly examined the evidence. Through it all, remained the one person who could provide first-hand testimony about Diana's final conscious moments, and his continued silence only made the public more curious. In 2017, on the 20th anniversary of Diana's death, finally made the decision he had been contemplating for 2 decades. He would break his silence, not for money or fame, but because he believed the time had come for the truth to be told. Too many false narratives had taken root over the years, and he felt a responsibility to share what he had actually witnessed. The decision wasn't made lightly. Spent months consulting with his family, his spiritual advisors, and even legal experts about the implications of speaking publicly. His children, now adults with families of their own, encouraged him to tell his story. They had watched their father carry this burden for their entire lives, and they believed that sharing it might finally give him some peace. Chose to tell his story to a respected French journalist who had covered the royal family for decades with dignity and accuracy. The interview would be comprehensive, covering not just the night of the accident, but also the 20 years of silence that had followed and the impact it had on his life. When finally sat down for the interview, he was nervous in a way he hadn't been since those early days as a young firefighter. This wasn't a burning building or a traffic accident. This was his chance to set the record straight about one of the most scrutinized events in modern history. The journalist began with basic questions about his background and his career as a firefighter. spoke about his training, his dedication to saving lives, and his pride in his profession. But everyone knew these weren't the questions that mattered. The real story lay in those crucial moments in the tunnel. When they reached the events of August 31, 1997, his demeanor changed. His voice became quieter, more measured. He closed his eyes briefly, as if transported back to that night, and when he began to speak, it was with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind thousands of times. Described the initial emergency call, the race to the tunnel, and the chaos that greeted them when they arrived. He spoke about the condition of the Mercedes, the obvious severity of the accident, and his first assessment of the 4 passengers. But what the world really wanted to know was about Diana herself. "When I first reached her," said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "she was conscious and moving slightly. Her eyes were open and she was trying to speak. Despite everything that had happened, despite the pain she must have been in, she maintained a dignity that was remarkable." The journalist pressed for more details about Diana's condition and her words, paused for a long moment before continuing, weighing each word carefully. He had promised himself that if he ever told this story, he would tell it completely and honestly, regardless of how difficult it might be. She was more concerned about the others than herself, revealed. Even though she was badly injured, she kept trying to ask about the other people in the car. Her first words to me were asking if everyone else was all right. That told me everything I needed to know about who she was as a person. This revelation contradicted many of the stories that had circulated over the years, stories that suggested Diana had been unconscious or had died instantly. The account painted a picture of a woman who, even in her final moments, was thinking about others rather than herself. The journalist asked about Diana's famous last words, the question that had fueled speculation for 2 decades. Took a deep breath before answering, knowing that his next words would be quoted and analyzed around the world. "Her last coherent words to me were about wanting people to know that she was all right," said slowly. "She was worried about causing others pain and sadness. Even as she was dying, she was thinking about how her death would affect other people." This simple statement carried profound weight. It suggested that Diana, in her final moments, was aware of her condition, but was more concerned about the grief her death would cause to those who loved her than about her own suffering. Also revealed details about Diana's physical condition that had never been made public before. He described how she had fought to stay conscious, how she had tried to communicate despite her injuries, and how she had shown remarkable strength even as her body was failing her. "I have seen many people face death in my career," explained. "Some are peaceful, some are afraid, some are angry, but I have never seen anyone face it with such grace and concern for others. She was extraordinary even in those final moments." The journalist asked if believed Diana could have been saved if circumstances had been different. This was a question that had haunted for 20 years, and his answer was both honest and heartbreaking. "I have asked myself that question every day for 20 years, admitted. "Her injuries were very severe. The doctors at the hospital did everything humanly possible. But I sometimes wonder if we had been able to reach her just a few minutes earlier, if the extraction had gone more quickly, if circumstances had been just slightly different. It's impossible to know for certain." This admission revealed the guilt that had carried for 2 decades. Despite having done everything professionally possible, despite having no responsibility for the accident or its outcome, he had spent 20 years wondering if he could have done more to save the people's princess. The interview continued for several hours, with providing details about the rescue operation, the transport to the hospital, and the moment when he realized who he had been trying to save. But it was his revelation of Diana's final words and her concern for others that would capture the world's attention and finally give the public a truthful account of her last moments. The response to this interview was immediate and global. Within hours of its publication, news outlets around the world were reporting on the Firefighter's revelations about Princess Diana's final words. The story dominated headlines from London to New York, from Sydney to Tokyo. For the first time in 20 years, someone who had been there, who had held Diana's hand in her final moments, was speaking publicly about what had really happened. The reaction was as varied as it was intense. Many people found comfort in his account, particularly his description of Diana's concern for others even in her dying moments. This portrayal aligned with the public's image of Diana as a compassionate, selfless person who always put others before herself. Royal correspondents noted that description was consistent with everything they knew about Diana's character. However, not everyone welcomed decision to speak. Some members of the royal family's inner circle expressed concern about the privacy implications of revealing Diana's final words. They argued that some things should remain private, that Diana's last moments should be sacred and not subject to public scrutiny. Critics questioned whether had the right to share such intimate details, regardless of how much time had passed. The media attention that followed his interview was unlike anything he had experienced before. His revelation about Diana's last words became one of the most discussed news stories of the year. Television networks devoted special programs to analyzing his statements. Newspapers published detailed breakdowns of his account. Social media platforms exploded with discussions about the implications of his revelations. Found himself once again thrust into the spotlight, but this time it felt different. He had chosen to speak, and he had done so on his own terms. The nervous energy and guilt that had plagued him for 20 years seemed to have lifted, replaced by a sense of peace that he hadn't felt since that night in 1997. The interview also prompted other first responders from that night to speak publicly for the first time. A paramedic who had worked alongside confirmed many details of his account. A police officer who had been at the scene corroborated his description of Diana's condition and behavior. These additional testimonies lent credibility to story and helped paint a more complete picture of Diana's final hours. Medical experts who had not been involved in Diana's treatment weighed in on his account. They explained that it was entirely possible for someone with Diana's injuries to remain conscious for a period of time, and that her ability to speak coherently was not inconsistent with the official medical reports. This professional validation helped silence some of the skeptics who had questioned his memory or motives. The most significant reaction came from Diana's sons, Prince William and Prince Harry. Through official palace channels, they released a statement thanking for his service that night and expressing gratitude for his respectful handling of their mother's memory. They noted that his account aligned with their understanding of their mother's character and that they found comfort in knowing she had not suffered alone. This royal acknowledgement was particularly meaningful, too. He had worried for years about how Diana's family might react if he ever spoke publicly about that night. Their gracious response validated his decision and helped him feel that he had honored Diana's memory rather than exploited it. The interview also had unexpected personal consequences for. People began reaching out to him from around the world, sharing their own stories of loss and thanking him for providing closure about Diana's death. He received thousands of letters from people who had been mourning Diana for 20 years and found peace in knowing that she had faced death with courage and grace. Some of these letters came from other first responders who had faced similar dilemmas about speaking publicly about traumatic events they had witnessed. They thanked for showing that it was possible to share difficult truths with dignity and respect. Several firefighters and paramedics wrote to say that his example had inspired them to seek counseling for their own unresolved trauma. Also heard from historians and journalists who praised his decision to set the record straight. They noted that too often, the truth about historical events becomes obscured by speculation and myth-making. By providing his first-hand account, had performed a service to historical accuracy that went beyond his duties as a firefighter. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the ordinary people who had loved Diana during her life. They wrote to expressing gratitude for confirming what they had always believed about her character. His account of her selflessness in her final moments reinforced their image of her as the people's princess who cared more about others than herself. The interview also prompted renewed interest in Diana's humanitarian legacy. Charities that she had supported during her lifetime reported increased donations and volunteer applications in the weeks following his revelations. It seemed that his account of her final moments had reminded people of the values she had stood for and inspired them to continue her work. Found this reaction particularly gratifying. He had always hoped that if he ever spoke about that night, it would somehow honor Diana's memory and continue her positive impact on the world. The fact that his interview had inspired charitable giving and humanitarian action felt like the best possible outcome. As the media frenzy gradually subsided, reflected on his decision to break his 20-year silence. The weight that he had carried for so long was finally gone. He had told the truth about Diana's final moments, and the world had responded with understanding and gratitude rather than criticism or exploitation. The guilt that had plagued him about not being able to save Diana's life had also begun to heal. The positive response to his interview had helped him understand that he had done something valuable that night beyond just performing his professional duties. He had provided comfort to a dying woman, ensured that she was not alone in her final moments, and treated her with the dignity and respect she deserved. Realized that in some ways, his 20 years of silence had been necessary. Speaking immediately after the accident would have felt like exploitation. But 20 years later, with perspective and wisdom gained through time, he had been able to tell Diana's story in a way that honored her memory and provided closure for a world that had never stopped mourning her loss. In the years that followed public revelation, his life took on a new dimension that he had never expected. The firefighter who had spent 2 decades avoiding the spotlight found himself becoming an unlikely guardian of Princess Diana's legacy. His account of her final moments had become the definitive record of how one of the world's most beloved figures had faced death, and with that came both privilege and responsibility. Continued working as a firefighter for several more years after the interview, but his colleagues noticed a change in him. The burden he had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence and peace that had been absent since 1997. He threw himself into training younger firefighters, sharing not just technical knowledge but wisdom about dealing with traumatic situations and the importance of treating every victim with dignity and respect. Story of Diana's final words became part of firefighting folklore, not just in Paris but around the world. Was invited to speak at fire academies and emergency response conferences, sharing his experience as a case study in professional conduct under extreme circumstances. He always emphasized that his actions that night had simply followed standard protocols, but his ability to maintain Diana's dignity while fighting to save her life became a model for first responders everywhere. Educational institutions began incorporating story into their curricula for emergency medical technicians and paramedics. His account demonstrated the importance of human connection during medical emergencies and showed how treating patients with compassion could make their final moments more peaceful. Medical schools used his interview as an example of how to maintain professionalism while providing emotional support to dying patients. The impact of his revelations extended far beyond the emergency response community. Mental health professionals noted that his decision to finally speak about his experience had highlighted the long-term psychological effects that traumatic rescues could have on first responders. His 20-year struggle with guilt and the weight of knowledge sparked new research into post-traumatic stress among firefighters and paramedics. Fire departments around the world began implementing new support programs for personnel who had witnessed particularly traumatic events. Story showed that even the most experienced and resilient first responders could be affected by what they witnessed, and that seeking help was a sign of strength rather than weakness. Also found himself becoming an advocate for accurate historical reporting. His experience with 20 years of speculation and conspiracy theories about Diana's death had shown him how quickly truth could become distorted by rumor and sensationalism. He began working with journalism schools, sharing his story as an example of the importance of verifying sources and the damage that false information could cause to real people. The conspiracy theories about Diana's death that had proliferated for 20 years began to lose credibility in the face of detailed, consistent account. His professional reputation and his decision to speak without financial compensation lent weight to his testimony. Gradually, the more outlandish theories about Diana's death faded from mainstream discussion, replaced by acceptance of what had really happened that night in the tunnel. His relationship with Diana's memory evolved as well. What had begun as a professional duty to save a life had transformed into a personal mission to preserve her legacy accurately. He became protective of how her story was told, occasionally correcting misrepresentations in media reports or documentaries. His first-hand knowledge gave him unique authority to distinguish between fact and fiction in the many accounts of Diana's life and death. The 20th anniversary of his interview in 2037 was marked by renewed media attention, but this time the focus was different. Rather than sensational speculation about Diana's death, the coverage centered on his courage in speaking the truth and the positive impact his revelations had on emergency response protocols and historical accuracy. Now in his 70s, had retired from active firefighting but remained involved in training and advocacy work. He had written a book about his experiences, not just the night with Diana but his entire career as a first responder. The book became a bestseller, with proceeds donated to charities that Diana had supported during her lifetime. The book revealed more details about the personal cost of carrying such a significant secret for 20 years, wrote about the strain on his marriage, the impact on his children, and the professional challenges he had faced. He also shared the healing process that had begun with his decision to speak publicly and continued through his advocacy work. One of the most moving chapters in his book dealt with the letters he had received from people around the world after his interview. He shared stories from other first responders who had found courage to seek help for their own trauma, from Diana's admirers who had found peace in learning about her final moments, and from families who had lost loved ones and found comfort in knowing that someone like might have been there to provide dignity and compassion. Also used his platform to honor the other first responders who had been with him that night. He made sure that their contributions were recognized and that they were not forgotten in the focus on his own role. The team that had worked to save Diana, Fade, and the others in the car had performed heroically under impossible circumstances and wanted their service to be remembered alongside his own. As entered his final years, he reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken after that night in 1997. He had begun his career as a firefighter, simply wanting to save lives and serve his community. He never could have imagined that he would become the keeper of one of history's most significant secrets, or that his decision to finally share that secret would have such far-reaching consequences. The legacy of Story extended beyond his own life. Fire academies now taught courses on the protocol, emphasizing the importance of treating all victims with equal dignity regardless of their fame or status. Emergency response teams around the world had adopted new procedures for dealing with high-profile incidents, largely based on lessons learned from the Diana case. His final public appearance was at a memorial service for Princess Diana on the 40th anniversary of her death. Now an elderly man, he spoke briefly about his belief that Diana would be remembered not just for her royal status or her tragic death, but for the compassion and selflessness she had shown throughout her life, including in her final moments. In his closing words, returned to the theme that had driven him to finally speak after 20 years of silence. The truth matters. People deserve to know how their heroes lived and how they died. Princess Diana was exactly the person the world believed her to be, even in her darkest hour. That is her real legacy, and that is why her story needed to be told truthfully. Passed away peacefully in 2045, nearly 50 years after that fateful night in the tunnel. His obituaries around the world remembered him not just as the firefighter who tried to save Princess Diana, but as the man who helped the world understand that sometimes the greatest service we can provide is simply being present with dignity and compassion when someone needs us most. The truth he had carried for 20 years and the courage he had shown in finally sharing it became part of history itself, ensuring that Princess Diana's final moments would be remembered not with speculation or conspiracy, but with the dignity and grace that had defined her remarkable life.